If we understand now this is an evolutionary process which goes back towards our origins, then you have to say, what drives evolution? And it's not just genetics. So if you think about evolution, Darwinian evolution, which is the survival of the fittest, for example. So what he had observed was that in the Galapagos Islands, you had these birds. And if they had these short beaks, which were really ideal for eating nuts, and there are birds that had these long beaks that were really good for eating fruit. And in the areas where there's a lot of nuts, you found a lot of these short-beaked animals, and the areas you had a lot of fruit, you had a lot of these long-beaked animals. And that, what he said was, that's not a coincidence. What happens is that the environment selects the genes that are most successful. So if you have a lot of nuts, you select for the genes, that's a selective pressure, which favors the survival of those genes that produce the short, thick beak, and the areas that have a lot of fruit have exert a selective pressure on the genes that give you the long, narrow beaks, right? That makes sense. It's just sort of basic evolution. And cancer does sort of the same thing. So if it's an evolutionary process towards this sort of original being caused by chronic damage to the cell, then it's not the genetics which is the important part, but it's the environment, right? And that is, the seed of cancer is there, but if you don't provide that environment that, you know, selects for this sort of survivalist, cancerous sort of, you know, story, then you're not going to get cancer. So what you have to do then is to say, this is not just a genetic disease, because for years we've been sort of thinking about it as a genetic disease. So we think, well, it's just sort of pre-programmed into us. But it's not, because the rates of cancer depend on your environment more than it does on your genes. That is, if you look at, say, breast cancer, if you go from Japan, a Japanese woman in Japan, when you move that person to San Francisco, their rate of breast cancer like doubles or triples within a couple of generations. It's not
Crazy.
the genes, it's the environment. But that's fantastic, because then if you can figure out what part of the environment is what's selecting for the damage. So in some cases we know it's smoking, it's tobacco, it's viruses, right? In many cases, we don't know. Breast cancer, colon cancer, what's the damage? Prostate cancer, we don't know. If we can figure out what part of the environment is driving this evolutionary process, then that's how we're going to reduce the risk of cancer. And so the question is, what is it in our environment? So they've studied this question for a long time. So back in 1981, they did a study where they're going to estimate the risks. So we do something called a population attribution factor, which is what percentage a certain risk factor will contribute to cancer. So tobacco smoke is the biggest, 35%. So tobacco is responsible roughly for 35% of cancer overall. But number two was the diet at around 30%, right? So really, like, very, very close to tobacco and dwarfing almost everything else. So all the stuff like the pesticides and the chemicals and stuff, that's like 1 or 2%, radiation, 1 or 2%. But cancer was caused in large part due to, one, tobacco, which we know about, and two, the diet. The question
Which
is,
never really got that, like, people didn't get that, like
people didn't
they didn't get
it
that.
was, and so they were looking for what part of the diet. That was what the tricky part was. So if it's diet, then what part of the diet is causing cancer, right? So they looked at fiber, it wasn't the case. They looked at dietary fat, it wasn't the case. They looked at vitamin deficiencies. And we've done so many studies like vitamin A, vitamin B, folic acid, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, omega-3 fatty acids, selenium. We've tested all of those in multi-million-dollar trials, and it wasn't deficiency of vitamins that was causing cancer. And the answer came somewhere around 2000. What part of the diet was the most important? And we didn't know this really until about 2003. And it turns out that it was obesity. was the biggest driver of cancer. And probably more specifically is that it was the hyperinsulinemia. That is, the too much insulin, which is very typical of obesity, is probably the what's driving cancer in those cases. And the reason I say we didn't know is because, so I went to medical school in the mid 1990s, and we never talked about this stuff.
No.
But in 2003, a very large study came out which showed that obesity actually raises the risk of all kinds of cancer. So now the WHO classifies 13 different types of cancer as obesity related, including breast cancer and colorectal cancer, which are, after lung cancer, sort of the most common cancers. So really, really important causes. And this is what's important is now, what we're doing is we have to go past again. So this paradigm, which gets us to evolution, which gets us to the seed and the soil, which is this sort of evolutionary ecology being the study of how the environment interacts with an individual, how you can change that environment in order to prevent cancer. And that's sort of what's sort of exciting about this, is that now hopefully we can start to understand and then make some changes that are going to minimize our risk of developing these types of cancers and hopefully preventing them in the future.
Yeah. And I mean, and even question basic premises. I was on the Mayo Clinic website in preparation of this interview. There's like a myths and there's like a myths and facts section on cancer and diet. And like one of the questions inside there was sugar, somebody saying, does consuming less sugar have any impact on cancer? Right. And it was like, there's no research, there's no evidence at all that consuming less sugar has anything to do with cancer. And again, Mayo Clinic, well-established place. They're doing the best they can based on the research and the evidence that's out there right now. And part of the thing that you're bringing in is that highlighting, especially with your previous books, that we're really talking about, insulin resistance and what that relates to, diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, is, well, if we know that obesity through this big study that you were talking about plays a major factor, and then what is it as part of that also contributes to obesity, and how do cancer cells get their energy, then of course we're going to want to pay attention to the level of sugars as one example that we're having inside of our diet, because that's going to cause a whole chain of effects that ultimately supports the growth of cancer.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of so Dr. Luke Cantley, who's a very prominent researcher, cancer researcher, he was one of the ones who sort of uncovered the link between sort of what sugar does, which is, it contributes to this high insulin state. And insulin, other than being a metabolic hormone, is actually a very, very potent growth factor. So it tells cells to grow. And if you're going to tell cells to grow, then you're going to tip the scales in towards, increasing growth of cancer cells, for example. So, here's a guy who's sort of like one of the most prominent cancer researchers, and he's like, sugar scares me. That's what he says in one of his articles he's written. It's like, okay, well, that's all I need to know, right?
Totally. And also too, on the basic premise of like, what is chemotherapy, right?
Yeah.
Could you explain like that link on that? Like, how do they get these well-intentioned poisons into cancer cells? Can you explain that to like our audience through, like exactly like what goes into chemotherapy that takes advantage of exactly that we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So when you look at the cancer cells, you can do something called a PET test, which is a positron emission test. And it basically looks at how avidly cells take up glucose. So when you do these tests, things that light up are eating a lot of glucose, and those are what are identified as cancer. So they're taking in, like 5 or 10 times the amount of glucose, which is a type of sugar compared to normal cells. So it's like, okay, when you look on these sophisticated sort of scans, you can see the cancer cells basically devouring sugar like there's no tomorrow. And it's like, well, if I had cancer, I certainly wouldn't be trying to eat too much of the stuff, because that the one place in the body that loves it 10 times more than the next guy is the thing, right? And then you have certain chemotherapies which take advantage of this. They try and get in, because they're, they mimic the sugar, and that's how they do it on the positron emission tomography testing, for example. They mimic the sugar so that the cancer takes it up and then it lights it up. And then people are trying to use that to sort of target the cancers as well. But interesting, it's an interesting story of how this sort of this new paradigm explains so much more about the phenomenon of cancer and how, what implications it has for screening, and this sort of evolution of, and this is sort of the promise of this cancer paradigm 3.0, is that if you now understand that what is happening now is that the cell is evolving away from normal cells, evolving into a foreign species. Because, and people always think, oh, that's so weird, right? But that's the way the body actually looks at the cancer cells. So when our immune system looks at a cell, it has a way to tell between self and non-self. That is, the immune system is a very powerful weapon. You don't want to use it on its own cells. That's like friendly fire, right? So you want to
type behavior.
Exactly. And it's very, very bad if that happens. So your body has these ways to distinguish between your own cells and everybody else. So bacteria, viruses, it will try and kill it. And when it sees a cancer, it will try and kill it. That's just the way, that's what happens. So it has evolved, this cell. So say you take a lung cell. This lung cell, which was originally your own cell, has evolved into basically a new species that is foreign. That's why
Frankenstein in your own body.
Exactly. And that's the reason that instead of trying, so the third paradigm, which is like, okay, now we have these cells that were originally part of us, but they've basically broken away and they've become their own sort of, invader. Now you say, well, instead of trying to just get indiscriminate killing, which was paradigm 1, or genetic targeting, which was paradigm 2, now what we're going to do is enhance the immune system to identify it. So basically you have these sleeper cells, like, you have terrorists, sleeper cells of terrorists in your city. And now what you're trying to do is uncover them so that you can get your police and your SWAT teams in there to kill these sort of domestic terrorists. That's what we're doing with immunotherapy. So these new drugs, these checkpoint inhibitors, are basically uncovering. So there are certain ways that these cancer cells hide, and they're basically trying to uncover them, right? And this is the new paradigm. What we're going to do is trying to uncover these sleeper cells, these hidden sleeper cells, so that they can be identified, targeted. We can, direct the immune system. So something like those new drugs you're talking about, the, those checkpoint inhibitors, then you get CAR T, where you're actually going to take the cancer and then engineer sort of a SWAT team that is going to identify and kill them, right? That's a new therapy based on this immunotherapy, but it's based more specifically on this new paradigm of looking at a cancer as a new foreign species. And it's very, very interesting because, it's the promise is sort of immense. Like, we're not there yet. And I hope that there's a lot more to come, but it's a totally new way of targeting cancer and treating it based on a whole new paradigm. And that's what gives me hope for the future, that there's more going to be able to be applied, because you can apply these lessons of evolutionary biology and say, well, what can I do to change the environment, for example, because that's evolution, that's biology. So things like losing weight and, intermittent fasting, which is another way to lose weight, trying to reverse your type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetics, of course, get much higher rates of cancer because it's also hyperinsulinemic. So reversing the type 2 diabetes, that's going to likely reduce your risk. To other things like chemopreventative agents. So there's not a lot. They've been studying stuff to try and prevent cancer, but there's not a lot. So the only things that might work, metformin gets a lot of research, which is a diabetes drug, may be useful. And then green tea, probably a very small effect, but there's some data from from Japan, where they do drink a lot of green tea, that some of the compounds in that are maybe effective. So hey, maybe that's a great thing to do. Drinking green tea is probably good anyway.
And really the two central themes that I got out of your book after really going through that history is, one, the future is hopeful in a way that is really understanding more of that central question, coming back to how we started off the podcast, which is what the heck is cancer? So we're better shaped for what we're developing in terms of treatments and drugs in the future, because we have the most robust answer that's actually getting to the source and the root of what is cancer. And the second component is exactly kind of what you were just talking about, which is, what are the things that you can do today to both enhance, whether it's some of the work of like Walter Longo or other people that are out there that are showing that fasting could support, right? Targeted fasting, especially before chemotherapy, can support and enhance the potency of these drugs if somebody actively has cancer. Cutting off the source of the supply of food, which is significantly reducing the amount of glucose so that we're not in this place of, hyperinsulinemia. And if you don't have cancer right now, and this is something that you're paying attention to in the future, what would be your biggest recommendations? Somebody who's healthy, who's listening to this podcast right now, and they're like, wow, this is all super fascinating. I've never understood this before, but now I get it. It's almost like you just gave us a master class on cancer. What are the one or two things to do today, besides not smoking, that will help us be the most resilient to potentially avoid this disease in the future or greatly minimize our risk?
Yeah, and so you get back to those sort of attributable risk, which is number one is tobacco smoke. So of course that's probably the single most important thing, and still is to not smoke. And then two is the diet, so avoiding hyperinsulinemia, which is that sort of what I talk about more in the obesity code and the type 2 diabetes in the diabetes code, is that insulin is this hormone which tends to make us gain weight and also causes insulin resistance. And too much insulin is a very potent growth factor. So that's going to. So if you want to avoid things that are going to raise insulin, which is eating a diet that is very high in refined carbohydrates, for example, sugar is probably something you should best take in small amounts. And then this other idea is that you really should be having a regular period of fasting every day. That's really sort of basic. It's the word breakfast. It's the meal that breaks your fast, because really you're supposed to be eating at, say, dinner time, which is, say, 6 o'clock, and eating at breakfast time, which is maybe 8 o'clock. So you're getting somewhere between 12 and 14 hours of fasting every single day. That's what's supposed to happen. That's buried in the word breakfast, right? Break fast. That is what's supposed to happen every day. That's not what happens to most of us in 2020. Because if you look at sort of societal norms and stuff, instead of having 3 meals and then no snacks, we sort of graze throughout the day, believing that it's actually healthy for us. I don't think it is, because every time you are eating, you're stimulating your insulin, which is giving growth signals to the cells, including the cancer cells, which love insulin. You look at a breast cancer cell, for example, has like 5 or 6 times the number of insulin receptors compared to a normal breast cell. They love this stuff. They love insulin. They love glucose. So therefore, you want to lower it. So eating sort of whole unprocessed foods is important. That's probably the most important thing. Not eating all the time is probably the second most important thing. And maintaining a normal weight as best as you can. I mean, that's not always the easiest thing to do, but if you are overweight, then try to lose that weight. If you are type 2 diabetic, try to reverse that type 2 diabetes. And that's the two, the tobacco and the diet are so overwhelmingly more important than everything else. Like you could also, look at the viruses, for example. You can get the, try to avoid the hepatitis B and hepatitis C, which cause cancer, and human papillomavirus. But those are sort of givens. But the diet and the tobacco are sort of in a class of their own. Everything else is like 2%, and they're at like 35%.
And I think I just want to say, from somebody from the outside who's been an observer of your work and consuming it and just super appreciative, the cigarette piece is easy, tough to break, but actually there's really a lot of really interesting stuff that's coming out of Johns Hopkins and other places of using psychedelics to help break cigarette cessation. Maybe those things we'll incorporate and we'll figure out new ways to help people. I think it's about 15% of the adult population smokes here in the United States. So it's gone down massively, and cancer rates have gone down for that. The diet, sometimes people listening here, if they're not familiar with your work, can think, okay, he's just talking about eating healthy, but really you're talking about getting out of this central paradigm, to use the word, where we're eating sugar in all its other forms. So people who are listening are like, I don't really have a lot of sugar in my diet, maybe a little bit in my coffee, some birthday cake here and there when I'm at parties. But, how often are you eating those meals of refined starches that are a regular part of our daily life? The big bowls of rice or ultra processed foods or breads or other things like that fine, have those things every so often as, parts of your diet. But when they become the norm, now you understand why so much of America is in that pre-diabetic state where they think they might be eating healthy because they're just a little bit overweight, but actually their diet is constantly spiking their blood sugar, which leads to all these problems with insulin that you're talking about. So you're not just talking about eating healthy, let's be a little bit more mindful. You're talking about really actually leaning in and getting your blood sugar under control.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the ways, a lot of people talk about diets, and there's all these different opinions on diets, but what people hadn't focused on really at all, I think, until a few years ago, was this meal timing. That is eating all the time really the same as eating, a few times? And I think the answer is no, because the point is that you need to let your body sort of digest, let your insulin levels fall so that you don't get all these problems with the insulin resistance and so on. Because insulin is not intrinsically bad, but it is a hormone that goes up when you eat. So if you eat constantly, is that a bad thing? And that's not been talked about a lot. And that's what I've really focused on, is that I think it's actually highly detrimental to be eating constantly. It's just not the way that you're supposed to be doing it. And we've never done it.
Which was a little bit of the trend of some of the advice, especially in like the 90s and 2000s, eat 6 meals a day, graze throughout the day. And really, we're backing away from that largely through the work that people like yourself are doing and just educating. Well, let's actually look, is this actually helpful or could it be harmful? And it's looking like it's not supportive of our overall health goals inside the body.
Yeah. I think the whole idea was sort of silly that you should eat to lose weight. And it's like, well, how's that going to work exactly? Right? If you're eating all the time, how are you expecting to lose weight? And of course, that if you eat a little bit and then stop, that doesn't suppress your appetite. It increases it. That's what an appetizer is. It's a small portion of food to make you more hungry, not less hungry, more hungry, right? So if you're going to eat small portions of food, you're going to stimulate your appetite, then you're going to stop, right? It's like when you start urinating, you just want to finish, right? When you start eating, you just want to finish. If you were to go pee and you just stop and start and stop and start, it's like, why would you want to do that? Like, that's the dumbest thing ever, right? So it's like you're going to make yourself hungry by taking a little appetizing portion of food, and then you're going to stop, right? It's like, oh, well, that's not really useful. And then you're going to do it again and again and again, 6 times a day. Well, why would you want to do that? That's ridiculous, because it's never been done before. Because prior to like 1977, nobody did that. So why would you even think that it's a good thing to do?
What role can fasting play when it comes to optimizing our health and maybe even longevity?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because a lot of the research is still coming out. But fasting does a lot of different things. And remember, when we're talking about fasting, it's really just any period of time that you're not eating. So there's no specific sort of, oh, you must do sort of like 40 days and 40 nights thing. There's no necessarily set limit. It all depends on the different type of person. However, there are several interesting things that happen as you get into sort of, 24 hours plus um, of fasting. And the thing that most people talk about most commonly, or the sort of most topical thing, is autophagy. And that's one of these things that has really, in the last, say, 5 years, has really broken through into the consciousness, public consciousness, because in 2016, one of the big researchers in autophagy was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So, of course, it brought a lot of publicity to it. A lot of people heard about it. And what it is autophagy is this process where, when you don't eat, your body starts to eat itself. That's what the word actually means. Auto meaning self, and phagein meaning eat. So you eat yourself. Sounds really bad. Sounds like, you're catabolizing, you're cannibalizing yourself. But that's actually very, very good, because what it does is, in a time where you don't have a lot of access to food, so such as fasting, your body is going to break down sort of the sort of low level stuff. So the proteins that are not working too well, they're really old, they're sort of junky, and it burns it off for energy. And it happens to these subcellular organelles. And basically, what you're trying to do is get rid of all the junk. So it's one of these mechanisms that's very hard to activate otherwise. And it's very important because a lot of the research was done on yeast. So this is actually a mechanism that has been conserved through evolution, basically through all sort of living things from yeast onwards. So very, very important to health, if you look at it from that standpoint. So what happens, of course, is that your body, like most people think breaking down is bad, but it's generally very good as you get older. So when you're young, you want to build things up, right? You're getting bigger, you're getting stronger, everything's growing in size. As you get to be an adult, it's not good to have a lot of growth. Extra growth is generally bad for you. So whether you're talking cancer, or whether you're talking, heart disease and stuff, which is, a lot of growth factors are actually going to make it worse. So one of the things that is really important to do is actually get rid of these sort of old junky parts. And then what happens, of course, during fasting is that as you sort of get rid of all that old junk, then your growth hormone is high. So as you eat again, your body is going to start rebuilding whatever is necessary. So you start with getting rid of stuff, then your body says, okay, so what do I actually need? And then it's going to rebuild it. So when you think about that whole process of getting rid of old stuff and then bringing back or rebuilding new stuff, it's the process of rejuvenation. So if you think about renovation, for example, you think that, oh, building is good, but you can't renovate that way. If you have an old, bathroom that you want to renovate, like the first thing you got to do is throw out all the old stuff. So you got to get rid of that avocado green tub and matching toilet kind of thing. You got to throw it out so you can put in a new tub and new floors and all that sort of stuff. But the first step is to get rid of the stuff. And that's why autophagy is so important, because without that, you can't actually rejuvenate yourself. If you don't get rid of the old stuff, you can't get new stuff in, right? It's like the spring cleaning for your body. Until you throw out all the stuff, you can't do anything. So that's why it's so important, this process of rejuvenation. So you're actually trying to make yourself sort of almost younger in that sense, because that's what that fasting does. And you might say, okay, well, what is the most important thing in terms of turning off and on autophagy? And it's really protein. So when you eat protein, that process of autophagy, so amino acids, which is the sort of building blocks of proteins, that is really just going to turn off autophagy just like that. So if people are eating sort of, a little bit all the time, and they're eating protein bars and all that time, you're really never getting into that stage of autophagy. And that's one of the things that people have talked about recently. Of course, the other things is that as you fast, what you're doing is you're tamping down, and this is another area of um, sort of very important sort of breakthroughs in the last 5-10 years, is that we have in our bodies certain nutrient sensors. That is, we sense what food energy is available. So we have insulin if you take carbohydrates, you have mTOR, which is senses if you take proteins, that kind of thing. So we have nutrient sensors. It turns out that these nutrient sensors are also growth factors. So when you're eating, you are turning up growth signaling. So anytime you eat, it's just built into our system. So if you look back, for instance, insulin, if you look back, insulin didn't start off as a nutrient sensor the way we think of it now, right? You eat, bread, insulin goes up. It's a nutrient sensor. It didn't start out that way. It started out as a growth factor. So what we've learned recently is that both the growth factors and the nutrient sensors in the human body, insulin, mTOR, are exactly the same molecule. So anytime you're eating, anytime you're taking nutrition, you're actually ramping up growth. And again, growth in most cases for adults is not a good thing. You don't want things to keep growing. That's how things break down. You actually got to get rid of stuff and then grow stuff. So a lot of these things like cancer, which is a disease of growth, are not going to be improved by insulin, say example, because that's going to increase growth, and cancer loves insulin, so it ramps up very quickly. So the thing is that when you do fasting, of course, you're going to reduce those nutrient sensors, which is going to intrinsically reduce growth and potentially reduce your risk of cancer, because we know that there's a number of cancers that are highly insulin sensitive, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, for example. So those are two examples of how fasting, sort of through autophagy and through reduced growth signaling, are going to be super, super important for longevity and, preventing disease, preventing cancers, that kind of thing.
You've shared before in other interviews that to really understand the importance of all this, we have to also understand and ask the most basic of basic questions, which is, why do we age? And you talked about how growth is not great as we get older, but for a long time, and maybe still a little bit right now, there's people that are not really clear about why is it that we age and what are the common things that contribute to that. And if we don't understand why we age, it's hard to understand how we can encourage longevity. So can you just take us through maybe a quick little history lesson of just what were some of the theories that were out there of aging, and what do some of the more contemporary ideas say around aging, and why are they so important?
Yeah, and it's still sort of not well sort of known. I mean, there's a lot of theories of aging, like, it's built in so that, you get this constant replenishment of genes and so on. Initially, they thought, well, it's just sort of like a machine, right? It gets old and then it breaks down and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not quite true, because our cells actually don't break down. We don't have the same cells. They sort of, our cells grow, they die, like red blood cells, right? Every 30 days, you sort of replace your blood cells. So they're not the same cells. So it's not like a machine. It's not like a stapler. You use it and you use it and you use it. Eventually it just breaks down and there's nothing you can do. That's not like our cells. Our cells actually rejuvenate. So then within our cells, we actually have this sort of built-in senescence mechanism, which is that after a certain number of replications, the cells can no longer divide, and therefore they start to get the problem with aging. And this is controlled with the telomeres, for example. So in the genes, you have in the DNA, you actually have these in the chromosomes. So DNA is packaged within a chromosome. At the ends of the chromosomes, you have these telomere caps, and sort of like an eraser on top of a pencil sort of thing. It just sits on top. And every time you replicate the cell, it sort of shrinks, and then once it gets down to nothing, the cell can no longer replicate, and basically it's senescent, or it can no longer do anything. Then it gets replaced with, say, scar tissue and so on. So you get less functional tissue and you get more scar tissue. But that's sort of this built-in senescent mechanism. Cancer actually circumvents that by getting rid of that, problem of the telomere cap. It doesn't reduce each time, and that's one of the reasons that cancer can actually replicate indefinitely. And that's one of the interesting things you see with unicellular organisms as well. As we talked about with the cancer code. But so aging seems to be this sort of built-in sort of clock, but it doesn't necessarily have to, because again, one of the things that people now talk about is, one, you can't do anything about that telomere thing. It used to be very popular. You used to see it all the time, but telomere-based science and all this stuff. It was just a big marketing ploy. You can't do a lot about it unless you really want to give yourself cancer or something like that. But the whole idea is that with aging, it's not just about the sort of age, it's about the health as well. So people talk now about the health span, and in terms of aging, can you really slow it down by increasing this sort of rejuvenation of, this is not of the cell, but of those subcellular parts, as with autophagy and fasting, and also to some extent slowing down metabolic rate, which I actually think is kind of interesting as well, because one of the things that people always talk about, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but people always talk about how they want to keep their metabolic rate revved up. And I always think, okay, sure, it's easier to lose weight that way. I get you on that. But if you're not trying to lose weight, is it really beneficial to keep your metabolic rate revved up? Because, it's like a car, right? You rev the engine, you can run faster, but you're going to burn out sooner. So it's like, are you really sacrificing one way or the other? So the way a lot of people look at it now is sort of this seesaw between growth and longevity. So, you can either grow really fast, but you're going to live a short time, or you're going to be on the other side of the seesaw, which is you're not going to grow and you're going to live long, right? So that's where people are looking at, trying to slow down growth, trying to say, okay, let's make sure that we're not stimulating these things that are going to increase growth factors, and those are all the nutrient sensors. So you look at some of the longest sort of lived people in the world, Okinawa and stuff, where they talk about, eating 80%, until you're about 80% full, and, people in Japan who also eat very little. So their metabolic rates are likely lower. Like if you ever go to Europe or Japan or some of these places, they don't eat much. I mean, compared to an American meal, like you go to a restaurant and you go, whoa, I just paid a lot of money and that's all the food I get. So they don't eat a lot. So clearly they're used to it. So therefore, if they're not eating a lot, then since their weight is stable, their metabolic rates probably are not running as fast either. So therefore, they may be, by eating smaller amounts by tradition, they may be choosing sort of to slow down growth and trying to go for that longevity as opposed to that growth, which is where Americans, North Americans, Canadians tend to be more, let's hit the growth, and then we don't hit that longevity as well. So if you're talking longevity, it's tied in very tightly to growth factors, growth signaling, that kind of thing.
Well, it seems, putting the two pieces of the questions together that you've answered so far, it seems like fasting has a very unique role, both when it comes to the health span aspect of improving your overall metabolic health, which is going to be one of the pathways to keep your metabolic rate down. Because if you are in better health, you're not struggling with processing food all day long, you're going to be able to keep your metabolic rate a little bit lower, which is going to improve your metabolic health, the way that I understand it. And then there's this other aspect where fasting also can play. It's not fully understood, but at least some evidence that's there. It can play a role with longevity. So it's both the health span and the lifespan. And is that a good way to think about it?
I think so. I think so. So, and fasting, interestingly enough, has always been sort of used as this way of staying healthy, right? You look back at all these traditions that we have, and, so like religious fasting, for example. So, in most religions, they have a period of fasting. And of course, at the time that these religions were established, there's not a lot of obesity. In fact, starvation is the predominant, is much more common than obesity back, say, 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, whenever these religions, and there's tons of them, right, that do the fasting. So it's interesting because when they talk about the fasting, it's a form of like they're not trying to punish themselves, right? It's not that they're trying to do something bad. They're usually trying to do something healthy for the body. So whether you're talking Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or whatever it is, sometimes it's couched in terms of sort of self-denial, but a lot of times it's just something it's supposed to be sort of intrinsically healthy for you. And it's interesting because this is outside of weight loss. So for North Americans, particularly, the weight loss thing is a huge impact. Like that's a huge health benefit right there from fasting. So, but in terms of longevity, it may be that also it's going to have like this massive improvement in longevity by doing something, and it's sort of always been recognized that it is something that's healthy for you, whether they talk about a detox or whether you talk about a purification or a cleansing or something. It's always termed in the same way that it's something that you're sort of clearing out the old junk sort of thing. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what autophagy is. So in the last sort of 10 years, we've actually recognized the science behind all of this old sort of terminology of cleansing and detoxification, that, hey, maybe it's actually true. Maybe we've only just sort of put the scientific term on what all these other people who, they didn't know the science, but they knew the benefits of what they were doing, and then codified it within these religious practices that various people follow. So it's an interesting way to look at it. So not only, as you said, with the health, in terms of weight loss and all that stuff, that's immediately obvious, but there may be that sort of hidden thing that takes a little longer for people to understand. Yeah, hey, this is something that's really, really highly beneficial for us.
Let's talk about caloric restriction and the importance of, first of all, for people that don't know what it is, just explaining, and how it fits in to the conversation that we're having here.
Yeah, so caloric restriction is probably the only really well-established scientific way of increasing longevity. And it's mostly animal studies. So they do this in animal studies. They take rats or something, and they have one that eats whatever they want and one group where they restrict how much they eat. And the group that restricts how much they eat generally live longer. So fruit flies, and they've done it in all kinds of animals. So that this has been shown for ages. And that was sort of this really interesting, and the first studies that came out with came 30, 40 years ago, as a real shock to people, because people thought, well, hey, if you're more nourished, right, more nutrients, more vitamins, you're going to live longer. But they didn't. They all live shorter. And that was quite a shock. And this is that whole, that's what sort of is that whole seesaw between growth and longevity sort of thing. So caloric restriction is well established in most animal models as a way to increase longevity. In humans, of course, it's really hard to do those studies. There was a few inadvertent sort of ways to do it. But the problem is that you have to go between malnourishment. You don't want to get malnourished. So there's this, continuum between calorie restriction, which is okay, and malnourishment, where you're just not getting enough vitamins and minerals and stuff, and then you actually do very badly. So sometimes they've crossed over. There was a couple of biosphere experiments where they sort of crossed that line. I think, remember those old experiments where people would live in a in this contained dome and stuff. And it was a little controversial at the time, but they wound up sort of fairly severely calorie restricting themselves. And it wasn't always pretty. It wasn't great. So that was sort of an inadvertent human experiment into it. A fascinating sort of study for like sort of thing to look at sort of 20 years ago. But the whole idea is that if you are well nourished, as most people in North America say are, then the calorie restriction may actually improve your lifespan and health span by a fairly significant amount. So caloric restriction, and the question then is, how do you do it? And this is one of the big questions. So you can do it like the Okinawans do it, where you say, I am going to sort of eat to 80%. And so you impose that sort of structure so that you can do it. If you don't impose any kind of structure and you think day to day, oh, I'm just going to stop eating, like, a little bit. If you have to keep thinking about it, it's never going to work. Fasting is another way, of course, to impose that sort of caloric restriction by giving you the structure. So if you say, I'm not going to eat today, then you're almost automatically going to, calorie restrict yourself. There's some interesting studies on fasting where they try to get around that, because people always try to say, well, is it the fasting or is it the calories? It's like, I don't really care. Like, if you do fasting properly, then you are going to be calorie restricted, right? But so what? If I tell people, okay, cut 500 calories a day, and it just doesn't work to lose weight, then it doesn't matter. It's just a failed strategy. So why do I care that if I can do it through fasting that I reduce 500 calories a day by saying, I'm just going to eat once a day, and that's going to do a 500 calorie a day restriction. If it's successful, it's successful. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not you restrict calories, how you restrict calories. If it works, it works, right? So don't worry about it so much. So there's some interesting studies lately that have tried to look at fasting. What they do is they try to get around that whole calorie part by saying, okay, you'll fast, but then you'll eat more when you're eating. I'm like, but that's not really the point of it, right? The whole point of the fasting is that when you're not eating, you're going to activate these mechanisms. You're going to get rid of some of this old stuff. You don't need to eat more because you're using up your body fat and all that sort of stuff. So the calorie restriction part of things is certainly part of the fasting. So therefore, I think you just have to take it all together, and rather than try to sort of tease it out and say, well, is it the calories? Is it the fasting? It's all part of the same thing. So it's just not that easy. If you eat once a day, or if you eat once every 2 days, it's not easy to pack all those 3 meals into a single one.
Yeah, I think what's important about what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I definitely get things wrong sometimes, is that, we call it caloric restriction, and it is the most studied model for increasing longevity, specifically in animal trials. But we don't want to get too caught up in the idea of the calorie component. It's really just taking a break from your body doing that work so it can enter into the repair mode. And when you understand that, you can take advantage of it, because even the idea, and we've talked about it a bunch of this podcast, that the primary recommendations and guidance from whether it's the FDA or the World Health Organization, that weight loss is primarily a math equation. And if you want to lose weight, it's just about eating less and exercising more, is really not, the full picture, and might actually be very misguided in its approach, because there's so many other aspects that go into weight gain, like insulin, the mechanism of insulin and how that plays into it. So it's important to understand calorie restriction and caloric restriction as a concept, but really we're talking about taking advantage of your body going into the right environment so it can go into repair mode.
Exactly. And that's the whole idea of this seesaw, right? You're either going sort of in growth mode, or you're going into sort of repair mode, right? And that's one of the things that it's been a real shift in the last sort of number of years, because of course, this whole idea of rejuvenation, repair, and stuff was probably only about 5 or 10 years. Like before that, everybody was like growth, growth, growth. So it's like, if that's what you want to do, then it's eat, 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 which is, of course, then you wound up with this whole obesity epidemic, then this kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this whole calories debate is, to my mind, always a little bit silly. So the whole thing about calories is that it's not a concept from physiology. It's a concept from physics. So it's a unit of heat energy. That's purely what it is, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about what your body does with that energy. So for example, if you eat a block of wood, it has a number of calories, because if you burn it, it has a lot of calories because it's energy. That's energy. But your body cannot do anything with it, right? So you eat a block of wood, it comes out your rectum, and that's it. That's all. There's no energy associated with it, even though within that wood there is a lot of potential energy. So it's the same thing, right? The calories, your body doesn't say, oh, you have this X number of calories, so I'm going to do this. No, your body has to translate that into something else. And that's that piece that's missing, right? It translates it into hormones, which is why you always have to look at the hormones, because that's sort of the language of the body. That's physiology, right? You can't take a unit of energy like physics and say, well, all calories are the same, because calories do different things. So that block of wood does nothing for you. If you eat a cookie, it's going to trigger off hormones that are incredibly different than if you were to eat, say, an egg, for example, right? So you eat protein and fat. The hormonal profile that you get is completely different than if you eat a cookie, which is completely different than if you eat a block of wood. Yet the calories are all equal. So how is that the same? Because those hormones are what tells our body what to do. Go into growth mode, go into repair mode, or don't do anything at all, right, with a piece of wood. So that whole thing about calories is, I say it just because that's what people are used to. It's easy for people to understand what's going on. But truthfully, the whole concept is quite useless to understand what's going on with the body. Like you take, 100 calories of cookies and 100 calories of an egg, for example, right? The minute those foods go into your mouth, the hormonal response is totally different. Therefore, our bodies are going to be doing something completely different with those two foods, even though they're the same calories, right? If your insulin goes up, your body says, store that calories as fat. If it doesn't go up, your body will say, take those calories and use them, burn it for energy, right? So it's totally different. And, I think that's where people get so messed up, is because we're so ingrained in this idea of calories, that calories are equal, because when you put them as the same thing, right? 100 calories of cookies, 100 calories of broccoli. Well, now they're both 100 calories, so you can treat them the same. You cannot treat them the same. There's no physiologic way like that they are the same in any degree. Like, yes, there's an overlap. Sure, there's more overlap between that and 100 calories of wood, but those calories is nothing. It's just energy, right? What our body does with that energy is what's important. Do you store it as fat? Do you build new proteins, right? Do you just increase the metabolic rate and burn it as heat, for example? It's all different, right? In one case, you're going to get stronger, right? In one case, you're going to get fatter. And in one case, your metabolic rate's going to go up. Completely different from the same 100 calories.
It's such an important point. And this idea, which was really a theory, the calorie in, calorie out model of obesity, and sort of why we gain weight, it's so indoctrinated into society that a lot of individuals, including well-established experts and doctors, took it as just settled science. And recently, there was a big paper that was done, a review paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Dr. David Ludwig. at Harvard, including a bunch of other doctors that were there too. And really, they took you through the whole journey of how we got there, how it was shaky science that sort of led to that understanding. And you've talked about this as well too, just highlighting it because that paper was published recently. We'll have the link in the show notes. And then all the way to the idea of understanding exactly what you shared about how hormones is the missing piece of the puzzle. You know, when I read that and I hear your example, I often think about, you know, NASA has the largest vacuum that they use to test devices that they're going to put in space. It's the largest vacuum in the world. And it's, I think it might be in Georgia, but I'll have to double check that. And if you take a bowling ball and you take a feather and you drop it in a vacuum, they both fall at the same rate. But in the real world, if you're in a Boeing 747 and you drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, they're not going to fall at the same rate. And our body is like that. It's a bunch of moving parts and pieces. It's not just physics that are in isolation. That's what I'm hearing from your message.
Well, exactly. And there's, I think the whole calories thing is sort of physics envy sort of thing, right? We want to be as clean and as precise as physics is, right? Because you look at physics, wow, they're building spaceships and, computers and all this stuff. And it's like, this is great, right? So physics is all very precise. It's all very math-based. And when physiology wants to be sort of, has all this physics envy, they're like, we want to be precise, just like physics. But then you ignore the whole messiness that is human physiology because does insulin go up? Take those 100 calories, right? Does insulin go up? Does it not go up? Does peptide YY, which is a satiety hormone, go up? Does it not go up? Do the stretch receptors in your stomach go up or down if you eat a big fibrous meal, like a big, if you eat a lot of, say vegetables and your stomach stretches out? Well, it doesn't have any calories because you could eat hair and your stomach will stretch and turn on your satiety signals, right? So there's stretch receptors in the stomach. Do those 100 calories, do they increase cholecystokinin, which is in response to fat, for example? What does it do to leptin? Like it's messy like crazy, but that's reality, right? And all it means is that, because every food is going to have a different hormonal profile, all it says is that certain foods for the same number of calories are more fattening than others, which is actually just common sense, right? I don't think anybody would really doubt that cookies and ice cream is more fattening than salmon and salad. It's hard to get fat eating salad. It just is, right? So that's very common sense. It's totally in line with what the physiology is, that, hey, all these foods have different hormonal profiles. Some are going to lead to more body increasing fat stores, right? And others are not. So therefore, some foods are more fattening than others. That's all it says, right? I don't see how that's so non-scientific. Because some people say, oh, you're a calorie denier or something like that. I'm like, I'm just telling you that calories is not a concept of physiology. It's a concept of physics. And it's this whole idea that they are equal and this whole idea of, creating a caloric deficit. I mean, that's another really stupid idea, I have to say. So this idea of, to lose weight, you have to create a caloric deficit. Now, that's always true. The question is, how do you create the caloric deficit? Remember, when you take that energy balance equation, you have body fat, which is a storage form of energy, right? It's a storage form of calories. It's stored calories. That's basically what it is. Body fat equals calories in, calories out. So when you look at that, it's inequality, right? X equals A plus B or whatever, right? So body fat equals calories in minus calories out. That's always true. The question is, so it's not two things. You have three variables there. And those always have to balance. So you can never have a deficit. You either have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So the question is, how do you create that inequality? If you want to lose body fat, you want to have calories in minus calories out. So that's true. So, but then they take that next step and they say, therefore, all you have to do is reduce your calories in. Well, two things can happen when you reduce those calories in. Either, right? So you have three things. You have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So you reduce calories in. Two possible things can happen. Either body fat goes down, which is what they tell you is going to happen, or, which is perfectly in line with math, right? Either when calories in goes down, either body fat goes down or calories out goes down. Both are possibilities because there's three variables here. What they don't tell you, which is what the science of the last 100 years has told you, is that every time you reduce calories in just by focusing on calories and not focusing on the hormones, what happens is not that the body fat goes down, but that the calories out or your metabolic rate goes down. So we know this from, I don't know, there's hundreds of years of research of this. The first research looking at this was from 1917. So more than 100 years ago, they showed this exact thing. Reduce calories in, reduce calories out. Your calories out goes down. So you take 2,000 calories in, drops down to 1,500, right? So two things can happen. Either your body loses 500 calories of body fat or your metabolic rate goes down by 500. Guess which one almost always happens? Is that the calories out goes down. That's just science. We know that. We've been proven that over and over again. So therefore, the question is not about whether or not a caloric deficit reduces body fat. Yes, it does. The question is, how do you create that caloric deficit? You cannot do that by reducing calories in. You similarly cannot reduce it by trying to increase calories out by exercising, which is the other thing that people always talk about. Because yes, when you exercise, you are going to increase the rate of energy that your skeletal muscles will use. But there's all these other parts of our body that exercise does nothing for. So there's your bladder, there's your kidneys. Like, does exercising increase the metabolic rate of your kidneys? Not in the least. Your liver, your heart, your lungs, your brain. Like, there's all these other organ systems that use energy all the time. The skeletal muscle is only a single system, right? So yeah, if you exercise for 6 hours a day, you can sort of overwhelm that effect. But remember, most of us are, say, burning 2,000 calories a day. You go for a run or something, you might burn what? You've seen those treadmills. That calorie counter goes up really, really slowly, right? So if you have somebody, okay, so you burn 200 calories, 300 calories, like, you're not even at 10% of what your body does using your kidneys, your liver, your body heat generation, all that kind of thing. So this idea that you're going to exercise your way out of it is also similarly false. And the other thing is that, remember, there's three variables. You increase your calories out by exercising, two things can happen. One is that you're going to take that energy from your body fat stores. That's what they want to happen. That's what almost never happens. What happens is that you eat more, right? And that's perfectly in balance with this energy balance equation. Three variables. They always only look at two of them, right? As if one of them is fixed, as if your calories out are fixed. And that's the whole thing that these people never seem to understand. I don't know why. It's very obvious when you just, put it out. There's three legs on this stool, right? You change one of the other two can change. It's not for sure that, they say body fat equals calories in minus calories out, reduce calories in, calories out. If it stays stable, then you'll lower your body fat, but it doesn't stay stable.
You say, and you start off in the book, you say the most pressing question in cancer research is the most elusive question. What is cancer? So can we start off there? Because it's still a question that we're asking today, which is, what exactly is cancer?
Yeah, and that's sort of the most important thing, is to understand a disease. You really have to understand what it is, like what causes it, what the disease is. And really, of the common diseases, cancer stands virtually alone because we have no idea what this disease actually is. So you look at other diseases like COVID or infections. So we've identified viruses, we've identified bacteria, we've figured out fungi, and so these are external invaders for heart disease and stuff. These are blockages in our blood vessels which starve the heart or the brain of blood, so you get heart attacks or strokes. So we sort of understand what the disease is, how it develops, and that kind of thing. But for cancer, this is sort of a very, very strange disease. So it's unlike any other disease we've ever faced. It's not a vascular disease like heart disease. It's not an external invasion like bacteria or viruses. It's not stones and stuff. There's all these other diseases, but what is this strange disease? And it's not that it's one of these sort of rare diseases. It's unfortunately extremely common. So the lifetime risk of cancer is somewhere around 1 in 10, and it's going to, affect everybody's life in that if you don't get it, you will know people who will get it. Almost everybody does. But we don't know what this is. And this is the whole sort of discussion in the book is what is this disease? Because it's a disease where you have a normal cell, which is part of your own body because it's derived from your own body. And for some reason, this normal cell breaks off and becomes cancerous to the point where it can kill you. And it kills, of course, many, many people. It's the second biggest killer of people. So our concept of what this disease actually is has been changing. So, it's changed throughout history, but really even in the last sort of 10 years, there's been this massive change in the way that we look at this disease. And this is what I call the paradigm of cancer. That is, I'm not arguing about, this is how to treat cancer. Like we've done lots of studies on, use this drug and these drugs in combination with surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. You put them in this sort of regimen and you can treat cancer. And I'm not disputing any of that. But in the end, it doesn't help you answer the question of what is it. So if you want to understand what it is, then you have to start sort of from the beginning, go through it and say, what is this disease? And that's where we've really made a lot of progress within the last sort of 15, 20 years. And most people haven't even really appreciated that. And that's what I wanted to bring forward is that sort of recent research and bring it to the people so they at least understand what this disease is that is affecting so many people.
And you do that. We were chatting a little bit before the interview started. You do that so eloquently in there. And you've outlined basically the three major paradigm shifts that have been there in the world of cancer. And before we get into kind of like the central thesis of you highlighting the work that really has been understood in the more recent years, let's take the listeners of the podcast through this journey, right? Let's take them through the paradigm 1, 2, and then eventually number 3, so they can understand and really go back to that central question, which is what is cancer?
Yeah, so this is such an interesting story because this is sort of the whole crux of the mystery that is cancer. So where we started was, the question is, say, what is cancer? Because cancer has been around a long time. You can go back, to mummies and stuff, and you'll still be able to find archaeological evidence of cancer even back in antiquity. So it's a disease that's been there forever. And the first sort of modern paradigm, so we can start actually even before that with the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Greeks thought it was this sort of excess of this humor. So they believed in the humoral theory where all diseases were caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors, and too much black bile was caused by cancer. That turned out not to be true. But they did give us the name cancer, which is derived from the word karkinos, which means crab, which is very interesting because the cancer does sort of tend to scuttle around the body and metastasize. Then through the 18th century, 19th century, they developed the microscope. So they really focused on the cell, and they could see that this cancer cell is related to a normal cell, but bizarre and different in certain ways. And they're able to categorize the ways in which these cancer cells were different than normal cells. So for example, if you had a normal lung cell, you could look at it under the microscope, and then you could look at a lung cancer cell and you could identify the differences, even though there's a lot of similarities between the two, because the cancer cell is originally derived from the healthy cell. So that was the first big sort of paradigm of cancer was, well, these are cells that really just grow too much. So normal cells don't grow. Like if you have a normal lung, your lung does not just keep going bigger and bigger until your head pops off your neck, right? It just sort of stays the same size, which means that the number of cells that are dying is equally matched by the number of cells that are being born every day. And there's a lot. I mean, the body has maybe 10 trillion cells that are being sort of born every day, and that many have to die every day in order for us to maintain a normal sort of lung, for example, so that it doesn't just keep getting bigger. A lung cancer, of course, is totally different. That is, it will just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it affects everything around it. So that's the big problem with cancer, is that it just grows, and then after it grows for a while, it actually spreads around the body, and then by spreading, it affects the normal function of those organs, or just by the sheer size, it's going to affect other things. So that was the first great paradigm, was this is a disease of cells that grow too much. And that, by taking that paradigm, you can say this is our understanding of what the disease is, and therefore you design treatments around that paradigm. So if this is a disease of too much growth, then this logical solution, kill cells, right? That's it. So the treatments that we derived were surgery, so basically cutting out the cancer. You had radiation, which is a more sophisticated way of burning the cancer, and that developed in the 1910s, 1920s, for example. And then in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you started to see the beginning of chemotherapy, which are basically selective poisons. So they kill certain cells faster than they kill other cells. So the idea is to kill the cancer before you kill the patient. These are all poisons. Like, don't be, don't not to put too fine an edge on it. These are all indiscriminate ways of killing cells, burning and poison. Okay.
Almost a little bit like you sometimes give the analogy of like warfare, right? We talk about the war on cancer. This is warfare on parts of our body that we've deemed to be out of control.
Exactly. So what we're doing is we're taking this sort of paradigm of excessive growth and applying logical solutions to excessive growth, which is ways of killing cells. So that makes a lot of sense. And it's not to take away from this paradigm. I mean, these are still the basics of treatment today. Like, even though this was from a while ago, we still use chemotherapy, we'll still use surgery, we still use radiation all the time these days. It's sort of the backbone of what we do. But it very soon came to the limits of where you could go. So 50s, 60s, 70s, there's a huge explosion in the number of chemotherapy agents, the way you combine them. So that was a huge advance, for example, when you're able to combine 2 or 3 different ones in specific ways. So you get this and this, and then 3 weeks later, you get this, this, and this, and then 3 weeks later, you get this and this, and you can combine it with chemo, you can combine it with surgery, you can combine it with radiation, and come up with this whole sort of cocktail and regimen that you go through. And survival of cancer, especially pediatric cancers, really improved dramatically through that period. But it reaches a limit.
And just to jump in, pediatric cancers, because again, kind of like in the book, you talk about there's always consequences with these items. So pediatric cancer, these young children who tend to have, in general, more resilient bodies, more ability to produce stem cells, can weather the storm of this warfare on their system compared to somebody who is much older, who's going through these treatments.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was one of the things, because if you're able to give a higher dose of these sort of poisons and so on, because children are more resilient than an 80-year-old, for example, then you're going to be able to kill off these cancer cells sort of more successfully. And but it shouldn't reach this limit. So you could really go no further, because it didn't answer the question. So this paradigm of cancer as a disease of growth is good, but it really leaves the question of why. Like, why are these cells growing so much? Like, we don't know the answer to that, right? So you have to take that next step and say, well, what is it that's causing cancers, and what is it that's driving these things to grow so much? So that was throughout the 70s. We had this revolution in genetics, so genetic engineering and genes and DNA and chromosome. That all came through the 50s, 60s, 70s as they identified DNA and so on. And this seemed to be the answer. So we knew all these things cause cancer. So we knew smoking, for example, caused cancer. We knew asbestos caused cancer. We knew radiation caused cancer. We knew, lots of these different things that cause cancer. We identified viruses that cause cancer. But the question is, okay, why are these separate things? So tobacco smoke and viruses, for example, which have really nothing to do with each other. Why are they causing cells to grow too much? Like it doesn't make any sense. Why would that even happen? And this is the second sort of huge paradigm shift, which was the genetic paradigm. That is, within each cell, you have genes that basically control everything. So they control the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, everything's controlled genetically. But a cell is going to have certain genes that turn on growth. That is, and there's also genes that turn off growth. So if you have a mutation in this gene that causes growth, that is either it tells the cell to grow too much, or the gene that stops the growth is turned off. So either you're basically hitting the accelerator for growth, or you're taking your foot off the brakes, right? There are genes that, slam the brakes on growth. And if you take the foot off, if you immobilize, if you negate that gene, it will also be pro-growth. So this was a fantastic paradigm. Like, it was such a sort of huge advance, because it took this first paradigm of cancer and answered the question of why. Well, it's a disease of genetic mutations that cause too much growth. And the question would be like, well, what's causing these genetic mutations? Well, these are random genetic mutations caused by things like tobacco smoke and viruses, which are basically causing damage to genes, right? So as you damage a cell, you're going to damage the genetic material. And this virus or tobacco smoke or asbestos, if by chance one of those mutations hits a growth sort of sensitive area of the gene, you're going to get increased growth, which is going to cause cancer, because it's a disease of too much growth. So it wasn't sort of negating the second paradigm, it was sort of building, right? So it was building an extra layer of understanding on this first paradigm.
And also that layer of understanding started to help at least some parts of the question, which is, why do some people get cancer and why do they not? Where previously it was a little bit of a crapshoot. You weren't exactly sure why was it that one person got it versus another. I mean, cultures had superstitions, that some people were evil or deserved it or whatever it might be, spirits inside the body. And now through science, we're starting to understand that no, actually there are some factors that are playing into why some people get it and some people don't.
Yeah, exactly. So then we could identify these genetic syndromes, for example, where cancer was a very big part of it. But then the question is, say, for tobacco smoke, well, that's not purely genetics. It's not targeted genetic, damage, right? When you smoke, you have damage all over the place. Why is it damaging these specific parts of the gene? And the answer in this paradigm was that, well, it's not really. It's just that by chance it's hitting that gene, because you can't say that asbestos is not genetically targeted like the way we can do with genetic engineering, go in and specifically target an area. This is just sort of random damage to the genome. But what they're saying is that, well, because tobacco smoke causes damage, the more times you damage, the more likely you are by chance to hit this critical area. That is just like if you buy a lot of lottery tickets, you have more chance to win the lottery, right? But in the end, it's sort of just by chance. So sometimes some people may not get a lot of smoke, but just by chance it hits a critical area. So throughout the 70s, 80s, this genetic paradigm sort of took over from the sort of first paradigm, which is just excessive growth, built on that knowledge. And this is what a lot of people still say today. That is, if you look at the American Cancer Society website, they say, oh, cancer is a disease of genetic mutations that causes too much growth. This is sort of the paradigm that we've sort of lived through most recently. So there's a huge optimism. So clearly this was true. We went to the cancers, we found a lot of genetic mutations. We said, this is it. This is the answer as to why we're getting it. So the first few treatments of this genetic paradigm. So now we're saying this is a disease, not of excessive growth. That's just sort of the effect of that. This is a disease of genetic mutations. Let's go in and find these mutations and fix them. So the first drug of the sort of genetic paradigm was imatinib, which was used in a disease called chronic myelogenous leukemia. And it was incredible. Like, it basically just cured the whole thing. It was ridiculously good, this drug. And sort of was one of the, and you know, was everything that was promised in this. So this was fantastic, right? So we developed this new paradigm, then we applied that knowledge to bring a drug which wasn't an indiscriminate killer of cells. It was a fixer of genes, and therefore that's how it worked. And this sort of validated the whole paradigm. And then shortly after that, there's another drug for breast cancer called trastuzumab, which was fantastically successful. It didn't apply to all breast cancers, but then what they did was they developed a genetic test to see if you had this mutation, and if you had the mutation, you would get the drug. And again, just incredible. What they're doing was sort of just incredible. So really a huge advance. So what the thought is that, hey, we're just about to cure cancer. This is the 2000s. So it's a new
We're on the
century.
verge.
We're on the verge. Like, the excitement was like palpable. It's like, we are very, very close, because this is genetic disease. We figured out what this disease is, and now we're going to use, you know, our sort of ingenuity to find it. So all we have to do is find the 2 or 3 mutations that cause each cancer, find the 2 or 3 drugs that will go in and fix those, and that's it, right? So if you have liver cancer, for example, we'll find the 2 or 3 genes that are responsible for growth, and then we'll design drugs or antibodies to go in and fix them, and that'll be it. They will, you know, done. Cancer will be done. And so that was sort of a huge sort of thing, but it took a lot of time. So there's the Human Genome Project. So remember, at the time, the gene sequencing technology was very, very primitive. So there's this project called the Human Genome Project, where we're going to sequence the genes of an entire human. And that finished in 2000 and was a huge deal. It took millions of dollars. And actually, you or I could do the same thing for like $20 right now, right? It's like you go to 23andMe or something like that, right? But you could probably get your whole genome sequence for like $50. That's how far the technology has traveled. But back then, it was a huge deal. So we were like, okay, well, we're going to sequence the genes of one entire human being, and that's going to lay out the map of what we need to fix. Like, we're going to be able to pinpoint these growth genes for each specific cancer. Boom, done. It didn't quite work that way. So then they went sort of double down on this genetic paradigm, and we went to the Cancer Genome Atlas, which came about sort of in the mid-2000s. So by the mid-2000s, this technology had advanced, and we weren't going to sequence one human's genes. We're going to sequence cancers, and we're going to sequence thousands of them. So you could take, you know, say breast cancer, and take 1,000 samples of breast cancer, and then just put them all together and look for the commonalities. Like, this gene is what we need, and this gene, and then you find the drugs to block them, and then you're done. That also didn't pan out the way we thought, because what happened was that what we discovered through these huge genome sequencing things is that there weren't 2 or 3 mutations in a specific cancer. There was like 100. So if you took a colon cancer, for example, and you said, okay, well, what genes are important for colon cancer? There was like 100 different genes that were mutated. And worse, the patient next to that, you know, if you have patient A with 100 mutations, patient B with the exact same looking cancer would have 100 completely different mutations. And it's like, whoa, okay, well, this is tough, because my paradigm has just been like stymied, because you cannot develop 100 new drugs for one patient and then have 100 different new drugs for the second patient, like sitting right next to him.
We were hoping to find a few commonalities, and yet there was all these differences that were there.
Exactly. So
and the cost and time of drug development being hundreds of millions of dollars. and multiple years. So
and
sorry.
the side effects too.
The side effects, exactly.
So you really couldn't do that, because the thing about the first few drugs like imatinib for CML is that virtually if you took, CML, that disease, you would find that one specific sort of genetic difference in like 95% of CML sort of thing, right? So that's one specific change in the whole cancer, which is why you could develop such a great drug. If you go to colon cancer and you say, okay, well, what are my, how many different mutations? It's like, well, there's 100. It's like, well, that's a lot harder than one. And it's like that one mutation may not affect all 100% of colon cancers. It may affect like 0.5% of them, right? So you're going to develop a drug which is effective for 0.5%, and 99.5 of the percent of people are not going to benefit. That's not going to be worth your time, even if you could do that, right? It's just not feasible. So in 2018, if you look at the sort of, they have this database of all the genetic mutations of cancer. The last number was somewhere close to 6 million. 6
Wow.
million different genetic mutations.
It's incredible.
In cancer. So this whole idea, you're going to find 2 or 3 different mutations and then you're going to be able to cure them, was it. And this is the reason the genetic paradigm completely failed to bring new treatments, because the success of a paradigm is to bring new and effective treatments. And it started out really great, but then what happened was that as you started to look deeper and deeper, those were the exceptions and not the general rule. The general rule was that there's tons of mutations in these cancers.
And if I could read a little excerpt from your book that I feel like just so eloquently shapes this sort of, in the second paradigm, you say, cancer paradigm 2 had hit rock bottom. Cancer was still undefeated and the situation looked bleak. Millions of cancer research dollars over several decades produced an abundance of drugs, some truly great, but most marginally effective, yet fantastically. And this just goes to the cost of, me jumping in, the cost of cancer care. So back to your sort of statement, but most marginally effective, yet fantastically expensive. Benefits borderline, toxicity high, and cost still higher.
Yeah, that's unfortunately what happened, because when these drugs sort of fizzled, this paradigm sort of fizzled a little bit. There's still drugs that are still, they're not very useful, but the way that the cancers are, if you have so many different mutations, each different drug is going to be much more marginally effective. Like it's just not going to make the same difference. So in order to recoup the costs and to make money, they just kept raising prices. And that was, sort of where we are today, unfortunately. So they got these drugs, they didn't work that well. So in order to make up, they just kept cranking up the cost. And so now, if you look at the drugs sort of 20 years ago in 2000, those drugs that were developed, like imatinib, they came out, at a certain cost. The cost of that drug just kept going up and up and up. And it was ridiculous, because the cost of drugs should go down. It's like your iPhone, right? If you have an original iPhone, the price of that technology goes down over time, like computing power, right? It goes down over time. With drugs, that drug is now sort of like 5 times the cost of what it was in 2000, yet it's the same drug. So why are the costs so high? Because there's no more research into it. There's no more technology to make this drug. The reason is they just wanted to make more money. And every drug company sort of said, well, it's a lot more profitable if we just keep it going than if we were to compete with each other on price. Let's just keep racking up the prices. So now you have drugs that are like $100,000 a year sort of thing. And unfortunately, which would be fine if they worked.
Right.
But if you look at how well they work, it's very, very, very limited usefulness. So they took, I think, 15 or 16 drugs in one study and said, well, what's the average increase in survival with using these drugs? And I think it was 2.1 months or something like that. It was very low. And if you think about it, so remember that cancer affects mostly older people. So you have to think, okay, say you're 80 years old and you get a cancer and you take a drug which is going to cost you $200,000-$300,000. And so you will live, instead of living from 80 to 81, you'll live to 81 and 2 months. And you'll have spent like $250,000, $300,000. You'll have sold your house. You'll have bankrupted your family. Is that really worth it? And
not to mention the side effects of every additional drug that comes in, especially when people are considering quality of life at that endpoint.
Yeah. And remember that those dollars that go towards paying those exorbitant sort of fees are dollars that don't go into other things that could make a difference. That is, nursing care, physiotherapy, personal support workers, right? That will make a difference to your quality of life, right? Instead, you're just paying that money. I mean, that's why you have that show Breaking Bad, where the guy wound up selling cocaine to afford his lung cancer treatments, right? It's so expensive, and everybody knows it, that it's basically out of range of the system. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I get into some of them in the book. One is that there's a change in the way they approve the drugs. So you could get drugs approved with much more marginal effectiveness than before. So the Food and Drug Administration normally has a certain bar that you have to cross before you get approved for use. And that bar got really lowered a lot because people wanted to see new drugs. So their answer to getting new drugs is to lower the bar for effectiveness. So you got new drugs, you just didn't get more effective drugs. And the problem was, of course, the paradigm that they were under, just looking at these sort of genetic treatments, just didn't really work. And that's where I said, that's where we were in about 2010. It was rock bottom, like that the whole thing was like, okay, cancer is still just as bad as it was because the treatments we've developed were not that effective. And the entire field was basically just spinning around in circles because they couldn't find this. They needed to replace that paradigm because that paradigm was not leading them to effective treatments.
Right. And they weren't necessarily sure where it was going. So they just kept on doubling down on the things that they thought were working, or in some cases, business decisions, driving the roadmap for research.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the paradigms are so important, because if you get the paradigm wrong, then you're going to go in the wrong direction. So all those drug companies, which are spending money to really look at developing great drugs for cancer, and it's billions of dollars. It's not like chump change. But if you get that paradigm wrong, then you're just chasing phantoms, right? So if you're not facing in the right direction, it doesn't matter how fast you run, you'll still never get there.
There's an architect, his name is William McDonough, very renowned gentleman who does a lot of, he wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle about building buildings like really with the environment in mind, and not just sustainability, but buildings that are good for the environment. He says this analogy, he says, if you're in a car and you're driving 100 miles per hour towards Canada, but you really should be going towards Mexico, it doesn't really do you a lot of good if all of a sudden you just slow down 60 miles per hour if you're still heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And this is the whole idea, is that you need to set a direction. So if you're doing research, if you're looking for a drug, you have to set a direction and say, okay, I'm going to attack the genetics of this problem. But if the genetics were not the main issue, then you're going in the wrong direction, and no matter how much effort you put in, you'll still never get to where you're going. And that was the reason from about 2000 to 2020, 2010, because some of these new drugs, they were developed sort of in the 90s. So for years, there's just nothing coming out that was making any difference. And that's where the sort of that's where most people think we are. But it's the sort of untold story is that there's this new paradigm that's sort of changed, and this is what's really important, is that now we've got this new understanding, which is hopefully going to lead us to better treatments, and it already has in some degree. So that's sort of cancer paradigm 3, which again takes the core of what the genetic paradigm was, Cancer 2.0, and again expands it to try to understand what the point is of these diseases. So if you look at what happens to the to the paradigm, first paradigm was cancer is cells that grow, and the question is why. So you get genetics, and it's genetics. Now you take the same sort of extra layer of understanding and say, well, why are these genes mutating? So the answer in cancer paradigm 2 was that they were randomly mutating. And that was clearly not true. Like, it was obviously not true, because remember that these cancers that come from, say you have a breast cancer. If you have a breast cancer in a sort of American woman in 1920 versus a Japanese woman in 2020, they're half a world apart, they're a century apart, and they will look exactly the same. And yet they've derived themselves from originally normal human breast tissue. So they come to the same point. That is, they look exactly the same. So there was nothing random about it. That is, if you have, a colon cancer, which affects, say, 1 million people, 1 million people have independently generated this cancer, which looks identical on pathology. There's nothing random about it. It's sort of like if you have, you have a classroom of children and you say, paint a picture. Well, you're going to get all different types of picture, right? You're going to get, some will draw a house and some will draw a flower, right? You're going to get all different pictures. But what if every single picture was a picture of a white elephant or something like that, right? That's not random, right?
That's when you're like, something bigger is going on here.
Something bigger is going on. There's something clearly guiding these mutations towards a predetermined spot. So if you go to a classroom analogy, maybe those children pulled out a picture and the picture was already drawn, right? It's already there, and they simply color it in. And that's why everything is exactly the same, right? So this is the point, is that this was not random at all. This is something that is guided, and what is guiding it towards this thing. And that's where we started the understanding of the next paradigm of cancer, which is the evolutionary sort of ecological view of cancer. So it starts back in 2000. So a couple of researchers were talking about cancer, and what they decided was that what they wanted to do was determine basically a sort of consensus on what is cancer. So they met and they said, what's interesting is that there's different types of cancer. There's breast cancer, there's lung cancer, there's liver cancer, there's all different types of cancer. And, we look at the differences between these cancers, but what's the same about these cancers? What's the same about breast and colon and liver and pancreas and leukemia? What's the same about all these cancers? So in terms of a problem, this is called the lumper splitter problem sometimes. That is, when you're doing classifications, do you lump categories together or do you split them apart? So say you have mammals. You could put whales, chimpanzees, and humans all in one category because we're all mammals. We all breathe air. So you lump them all together. You can also split them apart and say, well, chimpanzees and humans live on land and whales live in the water. So you can split them apart. So you can split categories, you can lump them together. They give you different information. So the lumping together highlights the similarities, and when you split them apart, it highlights the differences. So cancer medicine had always split breast cancer versus colon cancer versus lung cancer versus whatever. What was different about this paper than anything else was it was really the first attempt to lump them together and say, what is the same about all these cancers? And therefore, this wound up being the most cited paper in all of oncology. So it was basically the most important research article in cancer history. So it was seeing how all these cancers are the same. And what they came up with a list of 8 hallmarks, but it basically comes down to this. Cancer cells differ from normal cells because they grow. That is, they don't stop growing, whereas normal cells should stop growing, right? Second thing was that they they are immortal. So that is, if you take a cancer cell, you can actually keep growing it and growing it and growing it in a lab, and you can do it forever. If you were to take one of your normal cells and try to grow and grow and grow, it will only divide a certain number of times before it stops. And that's called the Hayflick limit. It'll just stop, it'll die off. So it's not immortal, it's mortal. Cancer cells are completely immortal, so they'll just keep going. Third thing is that these cells tend to move around a lot. That is metastasize. That is, a lung cell stays in the lung. It doesn't go around into your big toe or something. Whereas a lung cancer cell will float around and go wherever, right? And then the fourth thing is that it uses a different way of energy, which is glycolysis. So those were the really core important thing. There's always differences between the cancers, of course, but the core things that link all cancers together, the best sort of scientific consensus of what cancer was these sort of hallmarks of cancer. So in 2000, they sort of started to say, okay, well, this is what cancer is from a scientific standpoint, and how does this develop? And so they, in about 2010 or so, they brought in some sort of scientists from the outside. And the idea, the National Cancer Institute had asked all these other places, physicists and astrobiologists and so on, about, give us some insights into cancer. So they asked this astrobiologist by the name of Paul Davies. He studies life on other planets. That's his saying. He's like, I don't know anything about cancer. And they're like, great. So from an outside point of view, we want to see what is your take on it, because physicists look at things differently than, say, a biologist will. And so the first thing he noticed was, and this was, very interesting because it's so sort of fundamental, is that cancer is not a human disease. So it's actually a disease whose origins run way past humanity. That is, if you look at more evolutionarily primitive animals, they still get cancer. In fact, almost every multicellular animal in existence practically gets cancer. That is, dogs get cancer, cats get cancer, rats get cancer. Even the most primitive organism, which is called a hydra, they found hydra is this microscopic thing you look at in the microscope. And even that gets cancer. So if you're
maybe not at the same rates as human beings, but they all still get cancer.
Yeah, exactly.
They have the ability to get cancer.
The ability to get cancer. And this was what's so interesting, is that there doesn't seem to be any multicelled animal that can't get cancer. Like virtually every cell in your body can become cancerous. That's very strange, because it's not like you get the same thing with other diseases, right? So a gallstone is a gallstone. It doesn't affect your, thumb or something like that, right? But every cell, your skin cells can become cancerous, your eyes can get cancerous, your, heart can get cancer, your lungs can get cancer. Every single cell, even the placenta, can get cancer. So it's like, okay, every single cell can get cancerous, and that not only in the human body, but practically every cell in a multicellular animal has that ability to become a cancer. So whatever this thing called cancer is embedded extremely deeply, way past humanity and human genes. So don't look in your human genes, because the origin of cancer went way back to evolutionary times. And this was the sort of insight that set into motion this sort of next understanding of cancer as an evolutionary disease. So if you look at the differences between a single-celled organism and a multi-celled organism, there's a very fundamental jump that needs to happen when you go from a single cell to a multi-celled organism. That is, single-celled organisms compete with each other for food. So say you have a slice of bread and you have mold on a slice of bread, which is a fungus, right? Those mold will compete with each other until the food is gone, then they'll die. There's no cooperation, but they just are basically each mold or each fungi or each bacteria, they're all basically out for themselves. So they compete with each other. When you get into a multicellular system, there are some important changes in that you have to learn how to cooperate together. So when you have several different cells, you have a lung cell which does one thing and a liver cell which does another thing, but they need to coordinate because the liver can't get oxygen and the lung can't detoxify. So they rely on each other. But what you can do is you can specialize and you can dominate your environment. And that's the advantage, is that you have specialization, you have, you can get bigger and so on. So you're going to compete more successfully. So it's the difference between competition, which is the domain of the single-celled organism, and cooperation, which is a multi-celled organism. So the cells within a multicellular organism, they have to cooperate. So it's like the difference between, say, an individual, like who plays an individual sport like tennis. Everybody else is a competitor, right? You can't have 5 winners of the French Open or whatever. Like you only have one winner. That's individual sports. When you get to a team sport, what happens is that you have to learn how to cooperate with your other team members. So say you play soccer or something like that, right? Then what's going to happen is that you specialize. So you have forwards and defense and midfielders and goalies, right? And it gets bigger, but you have to learn to cooperate. The other players,
the system, the more cooperation that's needed.
Exactly. So that's a huge fundamental shift in the way that multicellular life is done. And when you compare cells in a multicelled organism compared to what single-celled organisms do, they differ in several fundamental ways because of this competition versus cooperation. So if you look at single-celled organisms, they tend to grow. They will grow and grow and grow, and they will never stop until they sort of run out of resources. The second thing is that they move around. So single-celled organisms, if they exhaust their food source, they need to move around, right? Nothing stops them from moving around. In multi-celled organisms, you want people to stay in the same place because your lung depends on your liver being in a certain place, and they have to be in the same place. And they can't grow. You can't have the lung keep growing and growing and growing, right? The third thing is that they're immortal. So if you look at bacteria, they're completely immortal. You can grow a bacteria in a flask in a lab and just keep growing them and growing them and growing them. As long as you keep putting in fresh medium, you're going to keep growing. So they're immortal. Whereas cells in a multicellular organism don't. They will die after a while. And then the fourth thing is the way they generate energy. Bacteria tend to use glycolysis, which is different from this thing called oxidative phosphorylation. But if you look at it, it's like, wow, the way that the cancer cell differs from a normal cell is exactly the same way that cells in a multi-celled organism differ from a single-celled organism. That single-celled organism is the evolutionary ancestor of all the original cells. That is all that programming in that single-celled organism to grow, to move around, to become immortal. That's all there. That was never in evolutionary time. That was never changed. They just built new programs on top of it. So that old original sort of kernel of programming of that single-celled sort of survivalist mentality all still exists in all of our cells.
The source code has been there since the beginning, right?
Exactly. And what's happening
for this cancer cells.
Exactly. And so what people said was that, well, this is not a coincidence, because what's really happening now is that you have that original source code that's buried deep, and you have all this other programming on top, which subverts all your programming to change this sort of competitive nature to a cooperative nature. But when you get damage to all of this other code, then this original source code sort of comes through. And that's why all the cancers in history all sort of look the same, because all of it was buried there already, whether you live in Japan or whether you live in America, whether you're in 2020 or 1820. This stuff goes back millions of years, all the way back from the jump from unicellularity to multicellularity. That's because cancer is the way that cancer differs is fundamental. That difference is fundamental to the way that life evolved on Earth.
Right.
That's why it affects everything.
And and jumping a little bit ahead, but part of the question that comes along with it is that, is cancer something that happens to us, or is it a survival mechanism, right? That's not maybe the words that you would use, but just using like words for the sake of this conversation. Is this an inherent sort of thing that was programmed? It's in all cells, not just human beings. And is it some sort of survival mechanism that cells have?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So it's actually the most sort of survivable way that a cell can be. So a lung cell, if you stretch back from the original cell, from when it originally came from a single cell to a multi-cell, there's all those genes that are programmed in there, which are sort of the survivalist genes. These are the genes that will survive on its own, not being part of this sort of cooperative team. And when all of this damage happens to everything else, you start to activate these sort of survivalist genes. And that is the way that cancer develops. So the reason that a lot of these, these things like tobacco smoke and viruses and stuff, what they do is that they exert a sort of selective pressure. It's got to be chronic, and it's got to be a sublethal damage, so that you're basically providing the environment that is necessary for this sort of survivalist tendency to succeed. That is the only sort of thing that is powerful enough to drive this change in cancer from a normal cell to a cancer cell is evolution. So what you need in evolution is a selective pressure. And that's what these chronic carcinogens, so chronic exposures, cause, is a selective pressure. That is, it has to be chronic because it needs time for evolution to happen. And it needs to be sublethal, because if you just kill all cells, then everybody's dead, right? Nothing survives to become cancer. If it's too weak, it's just not strong enough. It has to be somewhere in the middle. So this sort of chronic damage to a cell, like you get with tobacco smoke, with
tobacco,
viruses,
ultra processed food that is known to have a carcinogen effect, air pollutants that are there, lead, arsenic, like all in that same category.
Exactly. So these chronic sort of sublethally damaging things will actually cause the cell to say, okay, well, now, how am I going to survive, right? If I just keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to die. So therefore, I'm going to start to activate some of this old programming, which is sort of in the way back, and I'm going to activate those genes that are similar to being a unicellular organism. So in other words, the cell is actually evolving sort of in a backwards manner, which is called an atavism, towards its sort of original form. And that's what the cancer is basically a single-celled organism, because that's what was programmed in all of us, and explains actually a lot of the phenomena that we see in cancer. That is, why does it affect so many people? That is because it's in all of us. The seed of cancer actually lies in every single one of our cells. And that's why it's so common in terms of it affects all animals, all multicellular animals, and it affects every cell. Every different type of cell in our body can become cancerous. Why? Because that was there from the beginning.
For the person who's out there who doesn't know about all the debates that are there, they just want to improve their health. They're just trying to break free of obesity or type 2 diabetes or feel a little bit better. And they've been trying, and they've been following the standard advice for years. And they actually feel like a failure because everybody around them has been telling them, you're not doing it hard enough, or maybe even you're lying. Maybe you're secretly cheating.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not cutting your food enough and you're not exercising enough. And that is a failed message. So I'm just so happy that people can get information that actually can make a huge difference in their life directly from the sources of individuals who are willing to ask and re-question what they were taught about in school. So just another way of me saying that I'm grateful for your work and message.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And I try to talk about a lot of this sort of physiological stuff on my YouTube channel, like, talking about things. For example, last week I was talking about sort of the role of monotony in diets and varieties, and how variety actually makes it more harder to lose weight, because you've got all these sort of delicious foods. Because we eat sort of for two reasons, right? You eat for hunger, but you also eat for pleasure, right? So if you take away the pleasure because you're eating the same thing day after day after day, then you're just going to eat for hunger. When you do that, you stop eating as soon as you're not hungry anymore. And that's going to play a role in the end. So you have these drugs, for example, that can suppress the appetite. Nicotine probably is a classic one, right? You just didn't really want to eat as much when you smoked. So people lost weight. And then when they stopped smoking, of course, they gained some weight. But, obviously that's not good for you. But the other thing is that, this whole idea of, oh, it's all calories in, calories out, so it's all willpower. Like it's a horrible message. It's a horrible message, because now you have all these people who, they listen to them and they say, okay, I cut 500 calories a day. And what happens, of course, is that their metabolic rate goes down. So your body burns 500 calories less, then the weight loss stops. But because you're burning 500 calories a day less, you feel horrible. You have no energy. You're feeling cold all the time. So you increase that a little bit. So instead of, going 500 down, you go say, I'm going to eat 300 less. But your body has burning 500 less. So now you're regaining that weight, right? So, but instead of those people saying, there's something wrong with this treatment of just cutting 500 calories a day, instead of that, they say, well, you must be cheating on your diet. It's your own fault, right? And it's like, no, it never was. All these millions of women who blame themselves for the failure of their diet, when the blame should have been on the diet, the calorie restricted, low fat diet, eating 6 times a day. Those were the things that were the problem, instead they were trying to shift that blame onto them, which was horribly destructive, right? You have people with, emotional problems and self-esteem problems, all because they thought that obesity equals sort of lack of willpower, right? And it was a horrible message, and it's still promoted by a lot of these sort of fitness guys and stuff, because they don't understand the sort of science of, hey, if you take 500 calories a day less, you could either 1, lose body fat, or 2, lower your metabolic rate by 500 calories. And option 2 is 95% of people go, their bodies tend towards option 2. So therefore, that's not good. You're not going to lose body fat. Your body fat stays the same. Your metabolic rate goes down. It's not a failure of willpower. They're still doing that diet, right? It's like on that show, The Biggest Loser, for example. It's always interesting to me because you look at them and they're doing all this stuff. They've got obviously lots of willpower. Like their minds will do it if they set themselves to it, right? They'll run until they puke, sort of thing. You can see it. And yet, we're supposed to believe that these people gain weight because they had no willpower. But just look at them. They clearly have a lot of willpower. It wasn't a failure of willpower. It was a failure of understanding that this sort of approach of calorie restriction without understanding the hormones is actually a failed sort of theory. It doesn't work. And it's not that it falls outside of thermodynamics, right? There's 3 variables here. Either of those 2 things will satisfy that condition. So therefore, you have to do something else. And that's why I talk a lot about it. Sort of, I get very sort of into it because I think it's so unfair to blame these people. It's like, think about it this way. Suppose you have a classroom of 100 children and one of them fails. Sure, that might be his fault or her fault. Maybe they didn't study. Maybe they were lazy. But what if all of a sudden you have 70 kids who fail? Do you think all of those kids were lazy? Or is it the teacher's fault? Because I think it's more likely the teacher's fault. So you take the same thing and say, okay, you have Americans or North Americans or the world for that matter now, because it's becoming a worldwide thing. And if only a few people are obese, you might say, well, those are lazy people. But if now 50, 60, 70% of the world is obese, it's not an individual failure. It's a failure of the system. You got to look at the system and say, what is it that we're doing, which is sort of focusing obsessively on calories? what is it that we're doing that we could do better? Because if we can do that, then we will have served those 50, 60, 70% of people. Instead, we don't. We say our system is perfect. It's all calories in, calories out. It's all willpower. You're just not following the advice. And we turn that blame, which should have fallen onto the system, onto the people who are suffering, which is just blaming the victim. And that's the problem I have with a lot of these things, is that it's all blaming the victim. It's all trying to turn our own failures as a scientific community, our own failure to understand the hormonal basis of obesity, and we're trying to turn the blame onto these people who are suffering from it, right? And it's like, if you're blaming people, you're not helping them. Like, it's not going to work right that, right? And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of academic medicine, and you look at a lot of these USDA guidelines. Oh, just eat less. Like it's like, yeah, that's not going to work. Like, that advice is not useful. If it was useful, I'd be the first one to give it. But it's not useful. It hasn't been useful. It has never been useful. So let's do better, right? That's what I always think.
It was such an important message, and I think that one way of doing better is limiting and having different sources of information that's out there. So again, another reason that I'm just happy that you're putting out the content and the books that you do. I want to return back to longevity, if that's okay with you. And I want to return back to fasting.
Yeah.
For somebody like yourself who's not facing, and you've written whole books on the topic of helping people with type 2 diabetes, helping people and showing that it can be reversed through food, lifestyle intervention, in the incorporation of fasting, obesity as well too. For somebody that maybe is not battling those things, which fasting and very much is a part of, and they are looking to take advantage of some of the topics that you brought up in the beginning, some things that our ancestors knew were a part. They weren't dealing with obesity rates the way that we were, but fasting was still incorporated into their life because there was some innate understanding of its benefits. And I'm sure you're in that category as well, right? You're not facing type 2 diabetes. You're not facing obesity. And you regularly incorporate fasting into your world. Now, I know you have apps and coaching and a whole sort of system and methodology, and it's so personalized and individualized, but would you be willing to share how you incorporate fasting into your own life right now for your unique goals?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you that my goals, I mean, it's funny because my goals when I started were not longevity at all. It was, I usually skip breakfast because I wanted to sleep until the last minute and then get up, roll out of bed and get to work, sort of thing, right? So I skip breakfast because, hey, why would I get up half an hour early every single day just to make myself breakfast, eat it? I'm not even hungry, right? Why don't I sleep for that extra half an hour? So, and to me, it still remains it's an important reason to fast. It's like, you get so much time, like this podcast, I put it on my lunch hour. So one, it makes fasting easier because I'm not thinking about it. I'm talking to you, right? So it makes the fasting easier. So put it on the schedule. That's a great way to just get right through it. But two, it means that I don't take another hour out of, the next hour and have to go home like an hour late. I can go home, I can read a book, I can do a puzzle, I can, play with my kids, I can exercise. Like, it gives me that time back. Makes your life simpler, right? So there's these benefits that come, which and perhaps it plays into longevity too, because by getting home earlier, I can do the things that I want to do, which is going to lower my stress level, which is huge, right? Stress is a huge killer of Americans. So you're simplifying your life, you're getting time back. Outside of the purely physiologic stuff of what fasting does in terms of obesity, of type 2 diabetes, and other stuff. But, you get better focus, you get, a much simpler life, you get a lot more time back, you save money. Like, there's all these other side benefits of fasting that you don't even start to realize. Against that, you have to plot, okay, so if you have all these benefits, why aren't you doing this? And this is what we talk about a lot in our coaching, is that it's not just about the knowledge. Okay, so there's three things. If you want to change behaviors, there's three things that you got to remember. There's the mind, which is the knowledge. So, of course, 10 years ago, fasting was severely frowned upon. But now, assuming that you know fasting, hey, it's not that bad for you and you want to do it, but just knowing about it is not enough. The second thing is sort of this, the body. So what is it that's stopping you from fasting? Is it the hunger? Because that's, even if you know you should fast, you may or may not fast because, hey, if you're hungry, so you got to know what to do about that hunger. And then you got to put in systems that are going to circumvent it. So if you got to know what you're going to do if you get hungry. So in my case, for example, I drink some green tea usually, or I have some coffee, and then by the time I finish it, I get a hot cup of coffee. By the time I finish it, the hunger passes, and I know that, and that's part of the system. One of the other systems, putting it on the schedule, like we're doing right now, right? So even if I was hungry, I wouldn't even be thinking about it, about, hey, where am I going to go for lunch? Because I've already got you on the schedule now. So by the time I finish here, I'm going to start my office and I'm all done. So that automatic system is what's going to get me through. And those are the systems that a lot of religions had put in. You're doing it with a supportive group, right? It's on the schedule. So Good Friday comes around, you know it's on the schedule, is the fasting. Yeah, is it hard? Yeah, but you can get through it, right? Same with Ramadan, same with, Yom Kippur, these other, things. It's on the schedule, right? You've got something to do. And the third thing, so there's the knowledge, so the mind, there's the body, which is what are those systems? How are you going to deal with your body not wanting to do it? And then there's the third thing, which is sort of the spirit, which is what are those emotional things that are going to stop you from doing it, right? So again, we eat for all kinds of different reasons, only one of which is hunger. So you eat because it's sociable, for example. You go out with friends and you eat. That's what you do, right? When you're fasting, do you have that supportive group? And again, that's how religious groups got through it. That's how millions of people do fasting every single year, whether it's on Good Friday or Yom Kippur or Ramadan. They do it because they do it as a group. They have that group support that's going to give you that emotional support that's going to let you do it. If you don't have that emotional support, and that's one of the things we try to do at the fasting method, is build this community. If you set those norms that, hey, this is our normal, you set that baseline, this is what our baseline is, then you can get through it. And that's nothing to do with knowledge that fasting is good for you or bad for you, right? These are totally different because that's the mind. This is the body and the spirit. So those emotional supports, those constructs that you're going to build to allow you to do that. So for example, 50 years ago, it wasn't so hard to get from, breakfast to lunch to dinner without snacking in between. There's the social construct that we had didn't allow that. Like you took your cigarette break, but people were not eating muffins at that time. They went outside and smoked or whatever. But that construct where you don't eat snacks was ingrained. Now you go to, you have a 2:00 meeting and somebody orders a plate of cookies for you. Well, even if you're not hungry, the cookies are staring you in the face, right? You're listening to some boring guy go on about, this and that, right? Oh, what's the next thing you have to do? And you're looking at the cookies, right? You're going to eat that cookie. That's just the way it's going to be, right? But you didn't have to because nobody had to order it, right? So those constructs that allow you to do it is also what's important. And this is where you have to really dig deep into, okay, so let's find a way so that it will work, because it is not only about the knowledge that it's good for you. We have that knowledge. We know we shouldn't eat cookies, right? But when you put in the other things like, oh, don't have cookies in the house, no snacks, or if you're an employer, I always think what you want to do is say, look, there's no eating at your desk. There's no eating except in the designated eating spots, right? Cafeteria and so on. There's no snacks in the boardroom. There's no snacks on the desk, no candy bowls. That's probably the best thing you could do. Then people are going to go from breakfast to lunch and not do anything. No donut shop in the, coming by, no snack cart coming by. Like those are not things we need. And with obesity being so important, it's actually going to be really important for the health of your things. And if I was an employer with a lot of people, that's the first thing I would say. I say, look, it's not fair to our employees who are trying to get healthy and lose weight. So therefore, I am actually just going to get rid of all of these things. Is it easy? Absolutely. You make the rule. Who's going to disagree with you? And everybody's going to be healthier, because as soon as you get busy, all of a sudden, no snacks, nothing. You're not looking at the guy eating a cookie at his desk, right? Not allowed. Those are the constructs that you can put in to make things successful for yourself. And those are the constructs that we used to have in our offices and so on that we no longer do. It makes it hard for us.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
A whole foods diet has some fructose in it. Yes, fruit has fructose in it. I agree. Yes, it does. The question is, who's that fructose for? When you eat a piece of fruit, when you eat an orange,